Good evening, everyone. I'm Carter Sneed, Director of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture and Professor of Law here at the University of Notre Dame. Given this fraught moment when we're all called upon to examine our individual and institutional consciences about the shameful injustice and consequences of racism, we at the DeNicola Center believe that an essential resource to draw upon in our own reflections and plan for moving forward together are the core principles anchoring a culture of life and civilization of love, namely radical hospitality, solidarity, and respect for the intrinsic equal dignity of every member of the human family, born and unborn. These are the principles that are generative of a commitment to fight alongside our brothers and sisters of color in their struggle for equality and justice. So, as we do at the DeNicola Center, we brought together a panel of brilliant and thoughtful friends from a wide array of disciplines to have a conversation this evening about how these core principles of the pro-life movement can offer us guidance as we move forward together, and to explore the essential points of connection and mutually reinforcing goods among the fights for equal justice under law for unborn children and for racial justice. And we agreed that there's no better place to have this conversation than the University of Notre Dame, where we do not shy away from hard conversations, and we stand as a countercultural beacon that has long recognized and affirmed that a commitment to the dignity of every person entails protecting the most vulnerable, including the unborn child and those who suffer from invidious racial discrimination. This can readily be seen in the university's official statements. Just a few months ago, in a formal statement, the leadership of Notre Dame declared that our commitment to the equal dignity of all, quote, compel us institutionally and individually to combat the sin of racism and work to include all fully in our community. And 10 short years ago, the leadership reaffirmed that, quote, consistent with the teaching of the Catholic Church on such issues as abortion, research involving human embryos, euthanasia, the death penalty, and other related life issues, the University of Notre Dame recognizes and upholds the sanctity of human life from conception to natural death. So this synthesis of a culture of life and the quest for racial justice are encoded in our university's foundational documents and statements. As Notre Dame's principal locus of teaching, research, and public engagement on culture of life issues, we at the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture are proud to sponsor tonight's conversation. And we are so grateful for the co-sponsorship of the College of Arts and Letters, the Law School, the Mendoza College of Business, and Notre Dame Right to Life, which I might add is the largest student group on campus. And now, without further ado, I will introduce our moderator who will introduce our amazing panel of friends. Professor Ernest Morrell is the Coyle Professor in Literacy Education and Director of the Center for Literacy Education at the University of Notre Dame. In addition, he is the Director of the James R. Squire Office for Policy Research in the English Language Arts, an initiative of the National Council of Teachers of English. He is an elected Fellow of the American Educational Research Association, a past President of the National Council of Teachers of English, and a co-convener of the African Diaspora International Research Network. Professor Morrell has authored 90 articles, research briefs, and book chapters, and 10 books, including Stories from Inequity to Justice in Literacy Education and Critical Media Pedagogy, Teaching for Achievement in City Schools. His scholarly interests include literacy studies, the teaching of English, media and youth popular culture, and education in the African diaspora. Professor Morrell received his doctorate in language, literacy, and culture from the University of California, Berkeley, where he was the recipient of the Outstanding Dissertation Award in 2001. He is the chair of the Planning and Advisory Committee for the African Diaspora Consortium and sits on the executive boards of Lit World and the Education for Democracy Institute. Most importantly for us, Ernest has been a faculty fellow of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture since he joined us here at Notre Dame in 2017. So now I will turn the evening over to my dear friend and colleague, Professor Ernest Morrell.
Thank you so much, Carter. Thank you for having me. And it's always a pleasure to collaborate with the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. And tonight's panel is no exception. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. We'll start with Dr. Jacqueline Rivers. Jacqueline Rivers is a lecturer in sociology at Harvard University, and she's the executive director and senior fellow for social science and policy of the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies. Welcome, Dr. Rivers.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Ben Watson is recently retired from a 16-year career in the NFL, where he won a Super Bowl ring as part of the 2005 New England Patriots. He is currently producing a documentary on abortion titled Divided Hearts of America, featuring Alveda King, Ben Carson, and other pro-life advocates. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Mr. Watson.
Thank you, Professor Morrell. And also, we have one person, Mr. Carter Sneed. Dr. Sneed is in there in the video as well, in the movie as well. So we do have some connections in the movie to Notre Dame, which we are very happy about. So it's an honor to be here with you all and talk about this very important topic.
And thank you so much. Carter gets around for sure. Next, I'd like to introduce Senator Katrina Jackson. Katrina Jackson is a Democratic member of the Louisiana State Senate for the 34th District. She has been a vocal defender of the defense of life at all stages and was the author of Louisiana House Bill 388, which was at the center of a Supreme Court decision on this term. Thank you so much, Senator Jackson, for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Next, I'd like to introduce Ms. Gloria Purvis. Gloria Purvis hosts the morning radio program Morning Glory on EWTN Global Catholic Radio. And she's the creator and host of the EWTN TV series, Authentically Free at Last. She served on the National Black Catholic Congress's Leadership Commission on Social Justice. Thank you so much for being with us here tonight, Ms. Purvis.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, and last but not least, my colleague, Dean Marcus Cole. G. Marcus Cole was appointed the 11th Dean of the Notre Dame Law School in 2019. In May 2020, Dean Cole published an op-ed titled, I Am George Floyd, Except I Can Breathe and I Can Do Something. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Dean Cole.
Thank you, Ernest, for having me.
Great. So now that we've met all of our panelists, a little bit about the format, what we've asked each of the panelists to do is to take 2 or 3 minutes to respond to a general prompt. Essentially, why do you think it's important to talk about racism as a pro-life issue? So each of them, as I said, will speak for 2 or 3 minutes about why this work matters to them and how they are engaged, but particularly addressing this connection between racism and the pro-life agenda. So we'll start with Dr. Rivers.
Well, I'm really grateful to the DeNicola Center for bringing this panel together, because this is really such an important topic. In so many ways, this is important to me because in so many ways, the Black church and the Black community have not been deeply involved in the pro-life issue. And yet such high rates of abortion among Black women here in the United States. In 2015, 36% of all abortions nationwide were performed on African-American women. That is just so deeply troubling, especially given the fact that according to the Pew Research Center, African-Americans are so deeply religious. We are people who we pray more often, we believe in the existence of God, and yet here we have a situation where young Black women are engaged in abortion. In fact, in New York City for several years, the abortion rate was higher than the rate of live births. So this is really important to me for that reason, because there is this connection between abortion and not just race, but poverty. Because there was a study in 2000 that found that 27% of women having abortions were poor. And in addition to that, 31% were within 200% of the poverty line, even though only 30% of women of that reproductive age were at that level of poverty. So there's really this connection between poverty and abortion, and between race and abortion. And it seems clear that in fact, there's a link between the three, because the poverty rate among Black women is almost 3 times the rate among non-Hispanic white women. In 2001, it was 25% of Black women who were poor. So this is all rooted in institutional racism, the high levels of poverty among Black women. And issues such as slavery, the New Deal, redlining, and the institution of the GI Bill have really created barriers to wealth formation in the Black community, have created barriers to accessing good education, and therefore have also created gaps not just in wealth, but also in income. All of this is related to these high rates of abortion among Black women. This is why this is such an important issue to me, because the two are right now indivisibly connected.
Thank you, Dr. Rivers. Next, we'd like to hear from Mr. Watson.
Thank you again for having me for this discussion, and particularly right now where we sit in July, a few months after the murder of George Floyd at the hand of police officers in Minnesota. There is currently an angst, a heightened sense of awareness when it comes to this topic specifically when we talk about racism. I, like many of you, have fielded questions about what can I do? People are reading, they are getting deep into the history of this country, starting all the way back to 1619 and even beyond that. There's a heightened awareness of all the things that we're going to talk about tonight from a structural, institutional level, from a policy level, things that have created the atmosphere when it comes to race in America that we see now. And we cannot leave from this place without being changed. It seems like we come back to this place every few years, and we get all excited and upset, and we cry together and we lament, and then we come right back here. And so the difference I want to see now is that we move from this place as a changed country, also with changed hearts and with changed policy and laws. When it comes to the life issue, so many call themselves pro-life, but when we talk about this issue of race, we get a deaf ear. And so why it's important to me and why it should be important to all of us who consider ourselves to be believers and consider ourselves to be defenders of the unborn is that this is a justice issue primarily. The Bible talks a lot about justice. It talks a lot about righteousness. In the book of Jeremiah, one of my favorite verses, chapter 9, verse 23 and 24, it talks about God being a God of loving kindness, justice, and righteousness, for he delights in those things. And so as someone who wants to defend the unborn, I believe that's a justice issue. Justice is simply giving people their just due, whether that's punishment or protection. And this also talks about treating people with equity. And so we cannot be people who consider ourselves to be advocates or warriors for the unborn, but when someone comes to us and tells us of their mistreatment while they are alive, we ignore them. We have to be people that advocate for those who are victims of sex trafficking, those who are victims of poverty, those who are victims of, yes, racism, because that is on the entire spectrum of justice issues. So many are turned off by those who consider themselves to be pro-life, but when I enter boldly into this discussion. And so the reason why I'm involved and what I hope that we get from tonight is that we first have a sense of humility. Going back to that verse in Jeremiah chapter 9, it starts off with talking about how we need to be people of humility. And we can only enter into this very difficult topic with humility first. And then we must turn our attention to truth. And that truth has to bring us to action. And so we need to be people, I need to be someone who can see the variety of, I have a friend that calls it the single garment of justice that covers so many issues of our day. And we can't simply pick and choose which one we need to be a part of, because in that way, we become hypocrites to many who God will want us to reach.
Thank you so much, Mr. Watson. Next, we'd like to hear from Senator Jackson.
Hello. I concur wholeheartedly with what everyone is saying. At some point, in order to really, really deal and tackle with the issue of life, I've always said that I'm a whole life advocate, which means I care about life at every stage of life. And I've always said that in a sense of caring about life at every stage, that shouldn't be based or shouldn't be diminished based on someone's race or skin tone or their culture or their class or their socioeconomic background. Race is at the forefront of the life issue, and it should be. Some have selected to ignore it, thereby diminishing their advocacy for life. I truly believe that when you advocate for life, you advocate for all life, and that at any time, like Ben Watson said, that you see someone's life being diminished or devalued or because of race, that if you truly are a life advocate, if you truly hold life in its sanctity, if you believe that regardless in the womb or outside of the womb, a human deserves a chance to really progress. That's the entire life issue for me. And as we've gone around the country, as we've passed legislation in Louisiana, we have always looked at how it's going to apply and its application of the law and what that means and how the law will apply to all races. But at this moment, and at many moments in American history, we are seeing in the area of race, African Americans being disproportionately treated, disproportionately placed in economic situations. We are seeing African Americans once again having to fight against police brutality and not having their rightful seat at the table. And so if we're going to really truly advocate for life, we must advocate along this issue, and we must make sure that life matters for everyone and that we assert ourselves as advocates who truly believe that Black lives matter.
Thank you so much, Senator Jackson. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Purvis.
Well, I believe we have to talk about racism as a pro-life issue because pro-life issues deal with the human person. As a Catholic, I value life from conception until natural death. And it would be really a false witness to the gospel, in my opinion, if I were to be silent about racism. Every person is made in the image and likeness of God. And racism says that God's a liar and that not everybody is made in his image and likeness. And not everybody is worthy of dignity and respect. And I see that being the same kind of arguments used to justify treating the unborn as if they are not made in his image and likeness and worthy of dignity and respect. And so I believe as a Christian, that I have an obligation to not only not do what is evil, but to actually do what is good. And so to talk about racism in the area of being a pro-life matter, I believe will help Christians understand that this is an issue that has a gospel mandate, that we must be involved in it. And I also want to say that, frankly, racism is a sin and people go to hell for it. And we need to help people understand that this is a very serious issue, that when we fail our brothers and sisters, fail to love them as God has commanded, that we will have to answer for it. And so because people hear the term pro-life and it already has some visibility, to help them understand that racism is an issue of a pro-life concern, hopefully helps people understand the answer to injustice is not to be less pro-life, but to be more pro-life, more loving. God gave us the capacity to do so, and we should do it. And so that's why I believe that racism should be discussed in the area of a pro-life issue, because it is, and because it's a gospel mandate.
Thank you so much, Ms. Purvis. And finally, we'll hear from Dean Cole.
Thank you so much, Ernest, and thanks to the DeNicola Center for including me in this discussion. I want to participate in this discussion not as a legal expert or business law expert or an employment law expert. Instead, I want to participate as a person of prayer. As a Catholic, as a Christian, my wife and I we prayed for 12 years to have children. It took us 12 years before God answered that prayer. And then after we had those children, we had 2 boys. After we had those children, we prayed over them every day. And as we sent them off to school, we would say a prayer over them every single day. And we told them that it's important to pray and to not just pray for your day, but also to pray for miracles. But it's just as important when you're praying for miracles to realize that you are an instrument of God. And that when you are praying for miracles, sometimes God wants you to do more than just pray for miracles. He wants you to be someone's miracle. And so we would tell our children as we sent them out the door, be someone's miracle today. But as they got older, and now they're 20 and 18, we found ourselves praying for them twice a day, not just as we sent them out the door to be someone's miracle, but later in the evening, before they got home, we found ourselves in prayer again about whether or not they're going to make it home safely. And I know that there are lots of other families out there that say the same prayer, that that their children will make it home safely. And we know that from experience that they don't have to be engaged in any wrongdoing for them to be victims either of crime or misdirected police brutality. And so as a person of prayer, I'm hoping that we could recognize the connection between racism as it's exercised in daily life and the lives that we pray over and pray for and bring into, and God has brought into being. And I want to echo what Ms. Purvis said. Each of us is made in the likeness and image of God, which means that God reflects many races and that we need to see each other as he sees us.
Thank you, Dean Cole, and thank you, everyone. So as I announce this next part of the format, please, panelists, feel free to unmute your cameras and microphones. So what we thought we'd do now, and again, thank you for those statements, is just have a free-flowing discussion. We have a couple of questions that we've pre-formulated and shared with the panelists, but also there are questions being populated in the chat function, and we'll get to those as well. We'll start with some of the questions that we've talked about, and then maybe with 10 or 15 minutes to go in our segment here, we'll shift and bring some of those questions from the chat room. This first question is for all of you to consider. How do you see the connection in your own fields and experiences between your commitment that unborn children be protected in law and welcomed into life and your devotion to racial equality? And we can start anywhere. Anyone who wants to jump in.
Okay, I'll go.
Thank you.
I've done a lot of pro-life work outside of clinics with maternity homes and things like that, and trying to talk about pro-life matters in the Black community, particularly protecting life in the womb. And the number one pushback that I get is the notion that people only care about Black life in the womb when it comes to politics or election time. And so to be able to show that the pro-life community cares about Black life, not just in the womb, but outside the womb, I think is important for us to step in and talk about issues of racism, police brutality, racial profiling, for consistency and witness. And because it's the truth, if we are truly pro-life, we care about these issues. And that's the number one pushback that I get, is for some reason the pro-life movement is perceived as one that's merely political and really doesn't care about life, Black people outside of the womb, and only cares about Black life when it can be used as a political ploy. And so to the degree with which we can give an authentic witness that is consistent, I think it helps people to believe that they can have a place in the movement as well, that they aren't just pawns, and that they have a vested interest also in Black life in the womb. Because frankly, I believe that talking about police brutality while at the same time stomaching or allowing the high rates of abortion in our community also diminishes that witness as well. How can we say Black Lives Matter if we don't mean it from the womb to the tomb? And so just in my experience of working in with women who are considering abortion, in discussions in the Black community about us being more involved in the pro-life movement around protection of the unborn, these are the kind of challenges that come up.
Great. Thank you so much. And real quick, I see others that are unmuted. I've been told it's not the chat function, it's the Q&A where you put your questions. But I see Mr. Watson, Senator Jackson, you're unmuted. Would you like to respond? Okay.
Sure. I wholeheartedly concur. What I find is in the legislative arena, I find a lot of people who question the sincerity of the pro-life movement when it comes to African Americans and really nurturing their life and advocating for their life. What I find is this: when I'm on the Senate floor, and of course 8 years on the House floor, is this: my fellow pro-lifers will vote for me on the life issue, on the, what I call it is the abortion issue, because life goes more way further than just abortion. And so where I take the most slack, where I have the most debates with my African-American constituents sometimes and colleagues, is in the sense of, well, where are they? they when it comes to other life issues? Where are they when it comes to the death penalty? And why are we always fighting this as a Black caucus, as a legislative Black caucus, then as lifers? Where are they when it comes to offering programs and things that give a hand up and not a handout to get people out of situations? A lot of African Americans in Louisiana and around the country are targeted by Planned Parenthood and others based on the fact that they say we really, you're on your fourth child or your third child, or you're on your first child and you're still in school. There are no resources to take care of them. One of the biggest issues I faced, and probably was most controversial, was Medicaid expansion. And, I said, this is a life issue. The Catholic bishops came to the table and said, this is a life issue. And I always say on the floor, even on my pro-life bills, say you cannot ask a person to choose birth, but not support that person's life and their opportunity at the American dream. At least give them the same opportunity that others have. So what I find is that there's a major pushback in the African American community to really come out and support the pro-life movement because they don't believe it to be authentic. They believe it to be a pro-birth movement, and to not really include the issues that really matter in allowing someone, helping someone and allowing them to choose life and making sure that they're able to give their child a life that they would want them to have. We all have our own responsibility, but at some point when there's so much legislation, one thing that Louisiana, and I can speak for Louisiana, we had the highest incarceration rate in the world. We were number 49 of 50 in education, but we were the number one pro-life state. So when Governor Edwards came in, who was a pro-life Democrat, and he had promised and we promised that we were going to turn some of that around, it was very, very important in that first year to gain pro-life support in the African-American community, to make sure we were no longer the highest incarceration state in the world, right? Capital of the world. And so we're inching toward there. And as we inch toward that, as we really begin to have the true conversation of what being pro-life means, we're seeing more African-American advocates come on. So we can't ignore the racism issue. We can't act like things that are important to someone's life out of the womb as they're, matriculating through life is not important in the life movement and the life advocacy. And so that's what I found to be very difficult in my area of translating in the African-American community what life means and how it, stands against racism.
Thank you.
I'll just add to that and just say that I found that the terminology of pro-life has been problematic in the circles that I've been in the locker room for 16 years as a football player, but also in neighborhoods where I've grown up, or even in navigating some of the pro-life community when it comes to speaking at different pro-life functions. The term pro-life immediately brings about ideas of Republican versus Democrat, liberal, conservative. It brings a host of other issues that seem to be anti-Black. Whether that's true or not, that's beside the point. And so it's always important to emphasize the fact that pro-life, take it out of the political realm. Although we do vote on these types of things, we need to be able to take that out of that realm and be able to speak to the truth about what it really is and what it really means. Because I believe Dr. Rivers said it earlier, the Black community is overwhelmingly pro-life in the sense of for life against abortion. We are. But the term pro-life, coming along in the 80s with Reagan or wherever it kind of started in that area, has come to mean something totally different than what the essence of what it is, which is something that I believe many of us across ethnic lines all agree with. So that's important, that we strive to really identify that this isn't a political issue. It's not just about accepting everything with some political platform. It's about being able to pick and choose the things that actually do support life through its entirety. I would say the second thing that I've bumped up against a lot of times is ignorance. And I say ignorance not in a derogatory way, but a lot of people don't know the history of our country. We're all learning it. I think what we're facing right now in this season of life is an increased emphasis on finding out the truth. Is there really racism still going on? If racism were to disappear today, would all the inequities change? Would the wealth gap that's 10-1, would that automatically come together? No, it wouldn't. Would incarceration rates change? No, they wouldn't, because the censuses have already been there. And so when people are able to, this is Black, white, and different, are able to dig deep into our country's history and read and learn, then suddenly the picture clears up, the fog is lifted, and they can say, wow, this racism thing really is beyond simply a personal, I don't like you because, you know, your ethnicity is X. It becomes an issue of, wow, these things have happened continually over and over again, and there are ramifications for them. Now we can get people on board to say, okay, how do we fix these things? But first they have to understand that there's a problem and where those problems intentionally came from. Great,
thank you.
Can I pick up on that?
Sure.
I think what Ben Watson has just said is incredibly important. And I think it doesn't get emphasized enough that history is incredibly important to understanding racism today and also to understanding life issues today. Americans need to understand the history of racism, and they also need to understand the origins of the culture that we're in right now. Margaret Sanger came out of a eugenics movement that was focused on purifying the race, purifying the white race. And that meant that people who had disabilities, people who were not of the right ethnicity, those people needed to be eliminated. And so we need to understand that component of the history of racism, that the history of eugenics and the progressive era has given rise to these structures that are part of our culture today. And unless we face that, we're not being honest with the society that we're living in. We're not being honest with ourselves.
The other thing that I would add is really picking up on what Senator Jackson said about the fact that the movement can really be seen as pro-birth instead of pro-life, because we're all for the baby until the baby pops out of the womb, and then how the mother feeds a child, clothes a child, access to high quality education, to a good standard of living, all of those things are irrelevant. And I do think that Ben is right. This is all extremely politically charged. It's so difficult, at least here in the Northeast, to find any Democrat who is pro-life. And increasingly, but on the other hand, as he also pointed out, it's assumed that you're Republican if in fact you are pro-life. This is really a golden opportunity for us to say to people who care about life, this is an issue which is deeply embedded in the issue of race. And this is an opportunity to demonstrate that you really care about life, not just about birth, and to bring in an entire community of people who stood on the sidelines because of the perception that the pro-life movement was largely racist. So I think that this is just a very important moment and an important conversation.
Great, thank you all. And there are a lot of questions coming in the Q&A about this distinction between pro-life and pro-birth. But before we go there, I want to ask a follow-up question. So almost everyone in their comments spoke to how it's important to get those who are focused on pro-life to be focused on anti-racism. What about the flip side? I mean, what is it that you're doing in your work or that you're seeing to convince those who are against racial injustice of the importance of connecting to the pro-life movement?
Well, I think actually that Senator Jackson began to speak to this, that, or perhaps it was Ms. Purvis, that it's so important to say, if Black life matters, then it matters in the womb. That Black babies, Black lives don't just matter, they certainly do matter when there's a white police officer with his knee on the neck of a Black man. Black life matters then. But it also matters when it's a baby in the womb. And so this is also a moment for us to say to people who are concerned about life, you can't just be concerned about, if we really tell the truth, a relatively small number of Black men who are dying at the hands of police officers and be unconcerned about tens of thousands of Black babies who are dying every year. So I think that the argument has to be made in both directions.
Great, thank you, Dr.
And I wholeheartedly agree with that. I remember in my second year serving, I was called out on the mic for being an African-American Democratic woman who was supporting life. And they said, shame on you. And I said, shame on you, because more Black babies die in the womb every year than from any sickness, illness, murder, or crime combined. For if you take every reason that African-Americans die every year and combine it, more African-Americans die by the hands of abortionists than by anything else. And so what I've said to them is this: if you truly care about the African-American community, you have to recognize this is modern day genocide of the African-American community, period. And that we are slowly becoming the minority of the minority at the hand of abortionists. At the thing that we promote, we're becoming the minority of the minority. And so that translates into a lot of different sectors. If I'm going to a voter rights rally, I talk about how we are truly diluting our own voter power, our voting power, by perpetuating modern day genocide and by supporting it. And so if I'm in the area of education, I talk to people, being a former educator, about how you don't know what the child that you're aborting in the African-American community will grow up and be. You don't know if that child was set to be, because God says, I know you before I formed you in your mother's womb, which means we're destined to be who we are before we even form. Whether we've killed the person that had a cure for cancer or sickle cell anemia. And so I really just talk real to them. That's just the bottom line, and say, listen, we are in and of ourselves, when we don't stand for life, when we don't stand for the life movement, when we do not do that, we are promoting modern day genocide in the African-American community. And our population is severely suffering from it more than anything else.
If I may, I'd like to add, when I have these conversations, what I notice seems to be the sticking point for people is how they perceive police brutality versus abortion. So police brutality and all these other things are seen as an existential threat, whereas pro-abortion advocates have done a very good job of convincing people that to be able to have the choice is a right, is a power, that this is if you are not allowed that choice, somehow you are losing your liberty. And for Black people who have been denied liberty for so long, you know, that sort of rings in their mind. And also, people don't understand the degree to which abortion has been targeted for our communities. People still believe, well, it's just an individual choice and it's not having this larger impact. Whereas with police brutality, it's something they have no control over, can happen randomly, yet abortion they don't see in the same way because it's something that somebody has to actively choose. And yet when you look at what happens when a woman who becomes pregnant, and we said, well, you have a choice. Well, does she really, if she has no support whatsoever, does she really, if even going to work and being pregnant will be harmful to her career, does she really have a choice? And so to be able to reframe abortion and help people understand that it is not an exercise of personal liberty, that it is actually a gross abuse of liberty, because we're supposed to use liberty to do what is good. But when we help them understand that it is not the right use of liberty, but rather an abuse of liberty, just like racism is, hopefully we can shift people's perceptions and understanding. Because I'll tell you, that's what I see in having these discussions in the Black community. They don't see abortion as the existential threat that it is.
So I think that that's just absolutely, I have to agree with that. I think the other issue is that it is much easier precisely because we as Black people and our allies, our woke allies, really, it's much easier for us to blame the white police officer. It's much more difficult and much more loaded to talk about young Black women who are choosing abortion. And so I think that there's a lot of sensitivity there. We have to be very thoughtful about these young women. We have to be very sensitive to them. And I want to say that I think that as much as I agree that we want to make the case to Black Lives Matters advocates, we also want to make the case much more strongly to the pro-life movement, because I think the ball is really in their court. It is really an opportunity for them to say, yes, we recognize in this moment. Think about all of the young people who've been out. hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people who've been out demonstrating, not just in the United States, but around the world. Has the pro-life movement showed up? How can we convince people we care about life if we wouldn't even do that? So I think the ball is really in the court of the pro-life movement, as much as I agree the argument goes both ways.
Can I, Dr. Rivers, one of the things, if I could give some advice to pro-lifers that are listening, for goodness sakes, stop saying things like the real racism is abortion. Stop trying to tell Black people that their concerns are not legitimate, that their concerns are not as important, and somehow that you don't have the capacity to do both. We can walk and chew gum, okay? And I think if pro-lifers, if you are going to show up, you're also going to have to listen. You cannot go in and assume a position of superiority over Black people as if they don't know what is best for their community. You've got to listen, you've got to be in solidarity, and you've got to be humble. And for goodness sake, please, please stop with the political talking points of the far right. You will turn people off faster than you know what. Don't use these coded race language like Black on Black crime and absent and Black fathers and all this stuff, because what it sounds like you're doing is you're not there to have a conversation, you're there to dominate. And if you cannot go in a position of listening and being humble, please just stay home, because you're going to do more harm than good. And if you're only going to see this issue as political, and for me as a believer, and is not one that is spiritual, that we are, you have to understand that we are fighting powers and principalities here. And I'd ask you to pray before you go and engage. And I'd also ask you to be humble and ask the Lord to help you and guide you and put a guard over your mouth and to open your heart to love as He does. Because too often, I will say, especially in this moment, so many Black people have come to me and said, so-and-so pro-life person is a racist, and they are just completely turned off by the movement. And no one wants to go into a movement where they're going to face racist, aggressive comments on a regular. That's a big turnoff. I had that experience taking Black people down to the March for Life, and somebody walked up to us and said something so racially insensitive. They looked at me like, sister, we ain't never coming here again. So please, please, pro-life white people, learn how to listen, learn how to be humble, and stop trying to dictate to Black people how they should vote, what should be their number one issue, or that somehow you know better than they do about what real racism is. Do not do that.
Thank you, Ms. Purvis. That's a good word. I think you took the word right out of all of our mouths, but you said it so eloquently. It needed to be said, because the whataboutism really does create a wall between the progress and really the message that some people are trying to send and others are trying to receive. And also, it's also an excuse for some people to not engage and to not really understand what is going on in the Black community. For me, in my circles, again, speaking as an athlete, but also as a father of 7, with my wife and I, we do a lot of speaking on the power of fatherhood. And when it comes to the abortion issue in general, no matter who's getting the abortion, whether they be wealthy or not, or poor, or whatever the ethnicity may be, fathers play a critical role. And so, the question, kind of go back to the question about what are we doing in our circles, challenging young men, older men, middle-aged men, when it comes to being fathers, whether you are married, unmarried, or whatever it may be. Statistics show that women are more likely to go to abortion clinics if their relationship is in flux, and if they don't have a partner there that is willing and able to stand beside them from an emotional, physical, spiritual, and economic standpoint. And so as men, we need to challenge other men. Not that we do it perfectly, but we need to challenge manhood. And in many respects, that has to come from another man, to challenge another man. But for many of us, we are too worried about being hypocritical, or maybe we've had some missteps in the past, is what I found a lot of times. Sometimes guys just feel like, I messed it up before. Well, you know what? You can do it right this time. Just because you didn't have doesn't mean you can't do. It means that the power of God may have to transform. You may have to learn some certain things about being a father. But we need you, men. And not only do we need you, but you have what it takes. God has put in you. I've had this conversation many times in an NFL locker room. God has put in you. You have what it takes to be the man, to be the father that you were called to be. You won't do it perfectly. But when we're talking about pro-life, and we're talking about the womb, and we're talking about the women that are carrying these children, you have to step into your role, especially if you had a role in creating the baby that is in her womb.
Thank you. Thank you all for those responses. I'm trying to read. I don't know if you're looking at all the questions that are coming in. I had a bunch of questions, but I think we're going to go to the questions that folks are asking, because this is where the conversation's at. And several of you have already spoken to this, but it seems as though a lot of the questions are honing in on this issue of language and how we can develop the right language to transcend. And one of those areas is how do we bring back pro-life from the political divisions we have in the country? And what are some strategies, maybe in your own work or as we think out loud, about how to elevate pro-life above a political divide in the country? And I think, like I said, each of you has spoken to it a little bit, but the question has come up in a couple different ways. I wonder if we can just speak to that more directly.
Well, I think if let me just start if nobody else minds. I think you have to approach this not as number one, you can't approach it as a political issue. You have to approach this as an issue that you are dealing with another human person, and check your motivations. Why are you pro-life? Is it because that's what your political party says, or is it because you fundamentally believe that each person in the human family, whether from the womb to the tomb, is worthy of dignity and respect, and their life matters, and their life should be protected? If you come for any other reason than that, I think you need to really check your motivations, because it comes out in conversations. So I would say, number one, purify your motivations. And recognize you're dealing with human persons, and speak with them in the same dignity and respect as you would want to be spoken to. And don't go into it to try to get people to vote a certain way or this and that and the other. Go in simply without political motives, and understand that you are motivated because you care about the human person. You care about every member of the human family, no matter what stage of development they're in their cycle as a human person. Simple as that, I think.
Thank you. Dr. Rivers, did you want to jump in?
Yes, I think I certainly agree with Gloria, and I also agree with her that this is really a spiritual issue. I like her emphasis on prayer, and I think that that's a place to start, to really humble yourself and to pray about it. I think that that's the beginning. It's really about changing attitudes and understanding. That's how the language will change. And so to go in with a very prayerful attitude, humbling ourselves as we approach people. But I also want to come back to something that Dean Cole said, the importance of knowing the history. So one of the questions that was in the chat was, how did the GI Bill restrict wealth among Black people? Well, the GI Bill allowed soldiers to get loans, get mortgages, get educational opportunities, get vocational training. But those things were often denied to Black soldiers. And disproportionately, they did not have access to the benefits of the GI Bill that white soldiers did, which then meant a huge contribution to the current wealth gap that Ben talked about, where the average white family has 10 times the wealth of the average Black family. That is not something that I think the average pro-lifer knows. I may be wrong, but I think that really understanding the history, beginning to come to grips with the history in a prayerful way, that's the way the language starts to change. It's not just the words we use, it's really the underlying attitude and underlying understanding of the depths of the problems.
Thank you. I was going to circle back, Dean Cole, if you don't mind. Maybe this is an appropriate time. You kind of teased us in that short statement about historical context. Maybe this would be an opportunity to flesh that out a little bit more.
Yeah, so you know, the culture that we're in right now is really a product of the same forces that gave rise to Nazism, the progressive movement and eugenics at the turn of the century. And Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of the organizations that eventually became Planned Parenthood, was deeply committed to racial purity for the white race. And she was deeply committed to a program of eugenics and saw abortion as a mechanism to rid the nation of the undesirables from the perspective of the progressives of the eugenics movement. It's the same progressive movement that gave rise to Woodrow Wilson. It had a parallel track in Nazi Germany, which is part of the reason why the Nazis took the approach of what they called the final solution, to purify the Aryan race. So the culture that we need to understand that the culture that we live in today is a product of that history. We have to be aware that the structures that are around us were designed or focused on eliminating us.
Maybe we can speak to this just briefly, because people are talking not only about language, but mechanisms for communication, whether this is USCCB or how do we bring awareness of this context to those in the movement?
Well, when I talk about it, I remind people that the moment this country decided that Black people were not human and could be enslaved all for profit was the beginning of our cooperation with evil, and that it still has, from a spiritual sense, we haven't really dealt with that evil, and so it permeates and ruins a lot of things in our country, and so we're dealing with that legacy today because we never slayed the demon the first time, frankly. I think the more that we can help people recognize from the beginning that we cooperated with evil and it has its impacts and strains reaching out now, I think matters. And also to be able to talk to the history. I mean, as a Catholic, we can talk about how in the United States religious orders and Catholics owned people. Even though it's contrary to our belief in the gospel, we owned people. We also can talk about the fact that Black men weren't seen as suitable to the priesthood. We have to talk about our particular histories and how people understand it. The scholarship is there. It's just not taught. And so I would like to see, frankly, in Catholic schools that they would teach more of this history about what the church, how the church cooperated and did not defend in certain ways that they should have, even though the popes had written clear statements against slavery. So I think the more that we actually talk about the history, the more that people are less defensive in hearing the truth, that perhaps we can start to have people wake up. But they've got to have the heart to want to hear it. And I think if people actually pray and ask the Lord to help show them the brokenness, that he will do that because he wants us to grow in holiness too. He wants us to slay this demon as well.
We have to not be so much respecters of persons as we are respecters of the truth. And we have to be willing to decouple our honor of certain heroes of the past and their actual conduct. And when I say that, what I mean is, we all have these conversations so much, especially when we talk about racism and we talk about enslavement. We hear these conversations about the founding fathers, and there's an unwillingness there to identify their faults. We can still identify someone's faults and hold them accountable for that while still honoring the great things that they did. We are no less American, no less great countrymen and women by saying, you know what that person did in this respect was a problem and it created much of the problems that we're having now. But, oh, by the way, I still also respect and honor them because they did a great thing in the founding of the country. And so many times we refuse to do that. And then on a more personal level, we need to bring that same idea and that same willingness to our living rooms. All of us have people in our family that you know of that are racist. It might be Aunt Betty. It might be your grandmother. It might be your sister or your mom. Are you willing to say to her or to him, what you're saying and what you're doing is incorrect in this area? I still love you. I'm not turning my back on you, but you need to stop because you're propagating an idea, an ideology that is wrong. And our children and their children are going to inherit it from you. I need to hold you accountable. So it starts with accountability first with the people closest to us where it's the toughest. And then we have to be able to decouple patriotism from the truth about our country's inception and our country's founding.
I agree.
Sorry, go ahead, Senator.
I'm sorry, I apologize. I agree. Let me tell you what I find to be one of the major hurdles in dealing with this is that as Christians, sometimes, especially in the legislative arena where I operate a lot in, is that we cherry pick how we legislate as Christians. What I mean is that we'll holistically agree that the pro-life, the pro-birth issue is a Christian issue. But then I see a lot of people legislating past that based on their party. Like, for instance, for me, if I solely legislated based on my party, right, I would never have stood up in the pro-life movement. So I think what we have to have is real questions, real conversations about what being a Christian, what does it mean to be a Christian and an advocate? And stop cherry picking what the Bible says. You know, a lot of people will say, well, I didn't vote for that because I believe that's the church place to help people. But the Bible says that the government will be on his shoulder. God never gave us an arena one over the other where we helped people. And so a lot of times when, and this too, a lot of times when we're promoting legislation that we believe that we know goes right in line with the life issue, they go to their parties. And so I don't think you can cherry pick when you're going to follow God and when you're not. Either you're his advocate holistically or you're not. Not saying that we don't make mistakes, but I think I know that is where we're having a major misinterpretation. Also, I think we have to be real about this. Just like this country has created generational wealth for some people through contracts, through contacts, through government officials, we have created, based on the laws of the past, based on the Jim Crow laws, based on, not having, allowing certain people to have a seat at the table. We have created generational poverty. And if those laws in the past help to maneuver and put in place generational poverty, it's going to take legislation and laws and being real about it to break that stigma and that generational poverty. But we're not willing to do that now as Christians. I am. I think everyone on this panel is. But that was birthed out of racism. But now the laws are gone. Jim Crow laws are off the book. But so many people have found new ways to create classism and make sure that some stay in poverty while others don't. And as soon as you talk about disadvantaged business enterprises, as soon as you talk about giving someone their fair seat at the table, people begin to say, oh, that's not needed. Oh, we reversed that with the 1965 Civil Rights Act. But you know what people are ignoring? The Supreme Court just took the teeth out of the 1965 Civil Rights Act. And for the first time in redistricting, states have been able to redistrict away minority seats. States have been able to redistrict away people's seat at the table, thereby further perpetuating this generational poverty. But why is that not a life issue? So I don't think you can cherry pick. And I think whatever you did to create racial injustice, whatever you did to create the stigma of generational poverty, you have to be as aggressive as making sure there's protections in law that it doesn't happen again. And what I'm seeing in America, even at the national level, is we're becoming more of a pro-life nation. Louisiana is the #1 pro-life state. But we're always itching back the clock on laws that set in place mechanisms for turning around the wrong that was done. And so I think that we have to have real conversations about that. And like Mr. Watson said, those conversations don't mean that we're bad people. Those conversations don't mean that the things that happened in the past are attributed to us. I'm not a perfect person. This is where humility plays a big role. I heard someone talk about humility, that when you can admit you did something wrong, but it doesn't make you a bad person. Because until you can really come to the realization that you were wrong in an area, it can never be corrected. So I've had bills that I've passed outside of the life issue. And someone in the field of practice of that, maybe it's a medical physician, and I voted for a bill concerning medicine. And I realized throughout the year that it was the wrong thing to do. I'm willing to come back to the table and file a bill to correct it, right? Because in admitting that I just didn't get it right that time, I'm able to get it right the next year when I sit at the table. A lot of people are not willing to do that. So cherry picking when you legislate and when you hold yourself out to be a Christian, not letting your party have total control over your platform. I tell people, if your party controls your platform, then God doesn't control it. And that's just the bottom line. So you have to step into any situation as an advocate, as a legislator, as someone who's working in abortion, in life clinics, as someone who's advocating on the street. You have to first come in as something other than a Democrat or Republican. That can't be your priority. And for so long, I'm seeing that as a priority.
Thank you so much. So I think that's a good segue. There's a lot of folks that are asking about what this looks like for you and your particular domain. And so that was a really great response to help us understand what that looks like in the legislative realm. Now maybe we can hear from Dr. Rivers and Dean Cole. What does this work look like for you on the ground at the Seymour Institute or at Harvard University, or what does this work look like at the Notre Dame Law School or for deans in higher education? Maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Rivers.
So one of the things I really wanted to say is that I think that research shows that people listen to the people whom they trust. What changes them is not simply exposure to facts. So just to add a little more to the history, the New Deal did a great deal for Black people, but it also disadvantaged them, because the only way that the New Deal could be passed getting the support of Southern Democrats was that the two industries in which Blacks were most employed, that is as domestics and as agricultural laborers, were left out of the New Deal, so that they were excluded from Social Security and from unemployment benefits precisely for racist reasons, for racialized reasons. I can present that fact to someone who is a racist. They won't hear it from me the same way in which they would hear it from someone who is white, someone whom they trust. So I think that what the DeNicola Center is doing here tonight is an incredibly important mechanism for getting the message out. Because as a leader in the pro-life movement, the DeNicola Center can send a message that pro-lifers will listen to, much more so than if it came from another source. So to me, that's a really important mechanism, that it has to be the people who are leading in the movement who begin to take this message about the connection between life and racism.
Yeah, so I agree with that. And in my sphere, I'm a university administrator, I'm a professor, educator. Universities have been contributing to human flourishing for 800 years, and they've been doing research and scholarship and teaching very well for 800 years. But it is not enough for universities to just do scholarship and research and teaching. We've got to be actively engaged in the real world. We have to take what we learn and put it to use. In the words of St. Paul, faith without works is dead, and we need to put our learning to use on the ground and to improve the lives of real people. So as a law school dean, one of the things I'm focused on, committed to, is improving the lives of people in underserved communities around the country. At Notre Dame Law School, we have a motto that we are training a different kind of lawyer. And I really believe that. I believe that we're focused on training lawyers who are not just good lawyers, but lawyers for good. Lawyers who want to take their training and go out into the world and serve communities. This doesn't mean that they all have to be public interest lawyers, but this does mean that they have to have a higher aspiration than simply making money or simply concluding deals. They have to be focused on improving society. That means going out into the world. Some of them are going to be civil rights lawyers, some of them are going to be corporate lawyers, but at the end of the day, Notre Dame lawyers will be lawyers who are focused on making the world a better place, whether that's exactly what they do with their workday, or in their involvement in their communities, or to what Ben Watson was saying about being a father, being a real father, and communicating what it's like to be a father or mother in their communities, and being the glue that holds our communities together. So there's lots that we can do as university administrators, as professors, but it has to mean that we have to be doing things in the real world and touch people's lives for good.
So I didn't actually answer the part of the question about what the work looks like. So I wanted to just say quickly that one aspect of our work has been trying to defend life, not just here in the United States, but also in the Caribbean, because there really is an impetus to export this culture of death, not just around the world, especially to places in Africa and the Caribbean, where there's a strong belief in God and a strong belief in defense of life. And so we had the opportunity to be in Kingston, Jamaica, and rallying with people against the effort to change the laws there. So the fight is not just local, it's also international.
Great, thank you. We had a similar set of questions about the work in the media or being public figures. So as very public figures, Ms. Purvis and Mr. Watson, maybe you could respond to some of the initiatives that you're doing, how you're using your particular position as someone who's in the media or someone who's in sports and entertainment to communicate about these issues.
Ben, do you want to go first?
Sure, I will. And by the way, Dr. Rivers, I'd love to go with you to Kingston next time. Let's take this show on the road. For me, as an athlete, but also kind of delving into film, like we talked about before, it's about influencing the influencers, really. I mean, we look at the power of sport and the fact that the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, these are multi-billion-dollar industries. People can't wait for these seasons to start. People listen to every single word that many of these athletes say, whether they be good or bad. And so in my sphere and in my experience, it's been about challenging those who consider life to be an important issue. Now, they have to realize also that there's going to be a risk. You know, Jesus talks about taking up your cross and following me. You are going to be persecuted specifically if you have this lens and you have this stance, because it is not popular in mainstream media. And so you're going to be looked at oddly, but also many people will follow you. And what my experience has been is that whenever I've spoken out about the issue of life, there are many people, thousands, who appreciate someone speaking out and speaking their language, speaking for the unborn. But it definitely is a risk. And so I always encourage, whether it's social media, whether you're doing film, whether you're doing commercials, whether you're in your locker room, to speak out. There are multiple opportunities. There have been opportunities where I've had interviews before, and you can steer those conversations toward the issues that are important to you, specifically when it comes to this idea of social justice. I mean, right now, you look across the board at different athletes, and many have created social justice organizations. They've created funds to help fund certain grassroots organizations. But at the same time, I'm always particular when I use the term social justice. I like to say justice. Now, not that social justice isn't real, and it isn't something we need to advocate for. But when we're able to strip off the justice part, the social part, and get down to simply what it is, justice, I can then challenge others to see other justice issues, to see the importance of other justice issues. And going back to my introduction, when I talked about trafficking and the like, I'm a part of an organization that has a lot of pro athletes that do a lot when it comes to rescuing survivors of human trafficking, sex trafficking. We support those organizations with our dollars. We go on visits. I've actually, been places where I've been able to support the restoration efforts of children who are brought out of the global sex trade. That's a justice issue. And so when I term that justice issue, I'm then able to turn to the men and women who are advocating against racism, and rightly so, and then say, that's injustice, so is this. This is injustice. And by drawing the line there, I'm able to challenge them. Now, whether they agree or not, because again, it goes back to being a political issue, which is the stumbling block for so many, just by that change in terminology, and by saying, hey, we're about defending the vulnerable, being a voice for the voiceless. Yes, we are. Well, here's some more human beings who are voiceless. how can we advocate for them as well?
I would say in my role, because I'm in Catholic media a lot, I've done also secular media as well. And by the way, Ben, I'm in your movie. I was interviewed for that. If they don't cut me out of it.
Hey, I said we literally have Dr. Cole, you're the only one up here in the panelists that has we sat down with Dr. Carter, Rivers, Gloria, Senator Jackson. You gotta get a camera on me. You and Professor Morrell, you're the only ones that we didn't get. So maybe on round 2, we're gonna get you in Divided Hearts of America round 2.
All right. So I would say if in the media, I didn't get into media because it was something I wanted to do. It was something that I really believe that God called me to do. I had no designs on being in media, but I am okay being made a fool of for Jesus. And I'm going to go forward and I'm going to speak the truth, even if it means I won't get invited back, even if it means I'm going to lose speaking engagements, because I'm not there to become famous. I'm there to serve Jesus Christ. And if you go into media understanding that and being willing to follow him and speak the truth, you may not be popular, but what you can be is faithful. So I use my role to also give commentary on things. So for example, when the people were lamenting that Aunt Jemima was being taken off the syrup, container, I help explain to them about how that image of Aunt Jemima further perpetuated stereotypes about Black women being always available and subservient to white people, and that it was really a racist trope. And to the degree with which that could be thrown aside and discarded in favor of a truth about the human person, telling the truth about Black women, we as people of faith, we as pro-lifers, we as people who understand the dignity of the human person should be cheering that. So I use my role a lot of times to comment on issues in the public arena from a faith perspective and help people understand how choosing the dignity of the human person in representation and how we tell stories is always a good thing. And I don't necessarily just follow the party line, if you will. I deeply think about things, I research issues, and I come to the table and talk from there, and also trying to shine the light of the gospel on it. And believe me, it's not made me a lot of friends. And in fact, some people want to label me a particular way, but I understand that those are the darts of the enemy, and you cannot be discouraged by that. You have to stay the course and be true to Jesus Christ and be willing to carry your cross as well, because with every Good Friday, there's a Easter Sunday. And that's what I'm waiting on, is my Easter Sunday.
Thank you all. So we have about 10 minutes and there are a ton of questions. So I will try, we'll see if we can get to as many as possible and try to get a couple of responses for each one. So pardon me, I'm trying to read and talk at the same time. So there's a question about what literature would you recommend to help unpack our history? So there were a lot of people referred to kind of need to be made aware of this or made aware of that. So maybe that's a quick one. People can just talk about like some recommended reading.
Yeah, one of my favorites is Ira Katznelson, When Affirmative Action Was White. A very provocative title and a great book. There is a new book out in 2020 on reparations, From Here to Equality. I also recommend that highly. And there's a book on Black banking, The Color of Money. So those are three good ones to start with, because it's really important to recognize that the wealth inequality, interracial wealth inequality, does not just stem from slavery. And that's what Katznelson speaks to, that it really is a long-term issue, that it was going on well into the 20th century.
Thank you. Maybe one more person wants to respond to that?
Yeah, I would say I've heard a lot of people respond to me when they have read Grant by Ron Chernow. They start to see how much opposition was put up to the Black freedmen. So I would suggest reading Grant by Ron Chernow. Slavery by Another Name is also a good book because it helps people understand what happened after abolition up until, I think, World War I. They can see the efforts that were made to criminalize the Black population, the efforts that were made to basically disenfranchise us. And also, I would say they can also watch PBS's series, Eyes on the Prize. It gives a good history of the Civil Rights Movement and the visual impact of seeing how abused Black people were, and to see how people purposely talked and did things to undercut Black progress. Anything you can get your hands on regarding the Tulsa race riots, I know there was a film made about it. It's really eye-opening when you see the cooperation of the government authorities with basically bombing Black Wall Street, which was a very wealthy, successful Black community. So when you start to open your eyes and see these things, the history is out there. There are many things that could be read. Those would be a few things that I would suggest. And also the African Americans, I think by Professor Gates, I believe is also on PBS, because you have to see some of our wonderfulness too, not just the bad things that happen, but some of our wonderfulness too.
There's another book called The Color of Law by Richard Rostein that is really opened my eyes to a lot of what Dr. Rivers was talking about. We talk about policy that was enacted really in a way that was discriminatory, that has led to the wealth gap. Talks about things like redlining. The list goes on, how we have residential segregation. A lot of people think that we live in the certain neighborhoods we live in simply because Black people want to live by Black people and white people want to live by white people, but that is not the case. It was systematically done on purpose. And that legacy is still here today.
The other thing I think to add to the list of media, so that people who might want to watch documentaries, 13th is an excellent documentary on mass incarceration. And Professor Henry Louis Gates also has a very powerful series on Reconstruction, Stony the Road. There's a book that accompanies that as well. And that really outlines that moment in the sun when Black people hoped with the abolition of slavery that there really would be equality. And it was a very hopeful time when there were actually Black representatives in Congress. And the story of how it was deliberately undone is very powerful.
Great, thank you so much. There are a couple of questions that kind of lean back to something you just said, Ben, about policy. And I know that Dean Cole and Senator Jackson yourself talked a little bit about how racism makes its way into policy. I'll try to pull a couple of these together, but one of the questions is what are some sensible policies to support more two-parent families and homes, and to tackle the fatherlessness issue that each of you spoke about?
Okay, I guess I'll go first. The things that we have really tried to do and where we've tried to advocate, especially to support policy and to foster two-family home is, and people may not think of this, a lot of our small businesses are African-American businesses. And so what we've been doing on policy to make sure there's not friction in a home, one of the number one reasons for divorces in the United States is lack of financial resources and how that plays a role in disputes in the homes. And so what we've tried to do is support DBEs, disadvantaged business enterprises. We've tried to make sure that small businesses are not left out. We generally had a tax structure here and in the United States that gave major credits and rebates to larger businesses, thereby leaving out the small businessmen. What we've also tried to do in our state is to facilitate after-school programs for the two-family household, which both parents are working to make a living, to give the children somewhere to go out to school where their parents can be comfortable, while also ensuring that they have a good education and tutorial. So what we've done is target policy. And what I call target policy is we look at what's happening in those communities to foster two-parent households. For me, criminal justice reform was one of those things that was seriously blocking two-family households. You would have a father or mother incarcerated for a crime that normally someone with financial means would not be incarcerated for, or someone not of my skin tone, because sometimes it's not about financial means. There has been, I'm a criminal law attorney as well by practice, criminal defense attorney. There has been a lot of inequities in the amount of time that African Americans receive for similar crimes committed by non-African Americans that receive no time or receive even probation with the benefit of an expungement immediately after probation, where even when we receive probation, what I found is that there's no benefit of expungement. So how does that play? And people saying, how does all of this play into creating and fostering a two-family household. It does. Because the more you cripple a family, the more that family will cease to, the more likely it is that that family will cease to exist. So that's what I call targeting, figuring out what's going on in the community. Why is there a lack of two-family households? Why is it dwindling? Because let me tell you, before all these laws, before all of these injustices, honestly, the African-American family unit was extremely strong. And we all know that. But through systematic racism, it has been torn down. And so rebuilding that has to be done with targeted policy that really addresses the issues.
Thank you so much.
So I want to echo what Senator Jackson just said. There's been a tremendous escalation in incarceration of African Americans over just the last 10 years. And a number of cases involving completely actually innocent people being sent to prison is the focus of the new exoneration clinic at Notre Dame, but also wrongful conviction clinics at other law schools. But we've seen a geometric increase in the number of African Americans who have been incarcerated in this country just since 2010, taking parents out of households. The other thing that I think is really important for us to recognize is that there has been an assault on Catholic adoption agencies in the United States because Catholic adoption agencies have focused on trying to place kids in family situations that are consistent with our faith, meaning two-parent households, not placing children with all comers. And this has an important effect on life because Catholic adoption agencies make it possible for mothers to have children, knowing that the Catholic adoption agency will place those children, but also those adoption agencies, in order to place children in families, stable families, need to be licensed by the states. But states right now are denying Catholic adoption agencies licenses because those adoption agencies are using their faith-based principles with regard to where to place children in order to carry out their mission. And that is not consistent with the political agenda of a lot of activists out there right now. So we now have states that are denying the ability of adoption agencies to operate according to their faith, even though the people who would want to adopt outside of those faith-based principles have alternatives. Nevertheless, because the Catholic adoption agencies are basing their principles on their faith, they're being denied licenses. And we need to recognize that as a life issue. And that's a policy that would support two-parent households.
Thank you so much. And that's going to unfortunately have to be the last word. I can't thank you enough for your time this evening. As you look in our kind of Brady Bunch Zoom configuration, Dean Cole, Dr. Rivers, Ms. Purvis, Mr. Watson, and Senator Jackson, you've been eloquent and succinct, and hopefully everyone has taken away as much as I have. So with that, and with a minute to spare, Mr. Sneed, we will turn it back over to Carter. Thank you again to all the panelists and everyone who tuned in tonight.
Thank you, Ernest, and thanks to all the panelists. It's just been an extraordinary evening. The level of the conversation was so compelling, the insight so incisive, the heart, and the really as challenging as a conversation was, and it was a very challenging conversation in the very best sense. We are so grateful for every single person to be so candid and so thoughtful. This is really, in my opinion, this is Notre Dame at its best. This is the DeNicola Center at its best. We're so grateful to all of you, every single one of you. And we should also mention our wonderful colleagues in ND Studios, our own staff, Ken Hellenius and Petra Farrell, our Culture of Life program manager, our entire staff, which I've said many times before, and I'll continue to say it until I can't speak anymore, is the most incandescent and extraordinary staff in the history of staffs in the known world and any other world that is unknown. Thank you guys so much. God bless all of you. This was a panel discussion worthy of the Blessed Mother's University. Please join us again at the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. I'm so grateful to all of you, and God bless you. Good night.